I'm sure you followed COC filing week. What did you make of the current roster of candidates so far?
I don't think there'll be any change in governance. My view is there is relatively a consensus on how to govern. It's the execution, it's not the policy. And if you go back to every administration since basically at least the second President Aquino, the administration slate in the midterm elections, at least for the Senate, generally wins a big majority, usually 8 to 9, sometimes in Duterte's all 12. So I think one should not expect a change, basically because the infrastructure supporting the administration candidates is very overwhelming at the national level. So it will be, in my view, more continuity, whatever your view of that is, that's the likely scenario.
So it doesn't matter that that there seem to be more families joining the races, the local races at least next year. It doesn't matter that there's now vloggers and influencers also trying to win seats. It doesn't change the landscape, you think?
Well, it's a different mode of the different type of the same type of candidates. I mean, are we having families coalescing and adding slates for the first time or replacing other family members? No. Did we have actors and media people who are of some prominence winning? Yes. Is this changing? No. Maybe it's some change in degree, some change in names, but not change in type.
So
You can say that's unfortunate, but that is reality that's been going on primarily for the last 20 plus years.
okay, I do agree with what you're saying, and I think pretty much everyone will not argue with you on that. But I want to know if you have noticed anything particularly different going into the midterm elections this time around. Is there anything, good or bad, that is
Well,
particularly...
okay, I don't
Yeah.
want to make judgment calls because I'm generally not happy that the quality of our candidates are based on popularity rather than achievement. But that's nothing new, all right? So at least in several polls, and that there are family dynasties that tend to rule regions or at least provinces or cities. Is that lamentable? You can argue yes, I would probably agree with you, but it's not something new. It's a continuation of an existing trend. And does it mean there'll be changes? Probably not. Do we need changes? Yes. I mean, I have always complained about our lack of critical thinking, and basically, like, I've always been railing about our lack of industrial policy and our slavish adherence to the Washington Consensus, even though the Washington Consensus has never really been followed by the people advocating it in the US and Europe. Look at what happened in 2008 when they had their crisis. They did the opposite of what they told Latin America to do in the 80s. And Asia and the Philippines, unfortunately, was in both the Latin American crisis and the Asian crisis. We were swept up both times. And they did the opposite of what they told us to do. So I think it's time for deeper thinking, updated thinking, and more important, nuanced thinking of what we need to do, because we keep adding our population by 2 million a year. We are not creating quality jobs for that. Our solution is to export people. And that is not, in my view, sustainable. And even if it is, it does not lead to transformational progress. Every manufacturing job on average creates 5 new jobs. That is the multiplier effect. An OFW creates no new jobs. He basically very valiantly and with much difficulty supports his family and his extended group back home. But it doesn't create new jobs.
I want to know your thoughts on the party list system, because that is also, a prominent theme, a backdoor to Philippine politics, as you may, and how it is being bastardized. But on the other hand, it has also produced congressmen and congresswomen who have been effective in the hearings, for example, from Akbayan, from Kabataan Partless Bayan Muna, we've seen strong candidates from their side, but also, to quote the former Senator Tito Soto, he said na marami na raw kontratista na ito yung ginagawang paraan para makapasok sila. I mean, talk about business interests at play here. I mean, what does that do, or how does that change the political landscape, the partyless system?
Well, to quote Charles Dickens in A Tale of Two Cities, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. Yes, it's both. I'm happy for the big thinkers who are trying to move certain social, political, and economic issues forward. And I'm sad that the party-list system is increasingly become another way for, let's just say, the political elite to continue their hold. So it's both. But the trend seems to be moving towards the not so beneficial trend, which is unfortunate.
Okay. And all that demands for change. And when you say that we need to change, I think pretty much everyone will agree with you. Nobody will disagree with you. But where do you see this change coming from? Because traditionally they will say it should be the middle class, right, who will always rally. And when you look at all the EDSAs before, the two or three EDSAs, if you may, it was the middle class who marched there. Are we inclined to do this again, or even that has to change?
Well, first, I agree with you completely that it's usually the middle class. If you even look at revolutions around the world, it's usually the intelligentsia in the middle class who feel their opportunities are being unfortunately restrained for reasons that are beyond merit, who do this. Now, one of the reasons I think we have not had a upheaval is because the tension is dissipated by many of them leaving to find employment. And you can't march when you're elsewhere in the world. So and also if they're providing a economic and social safety net at much personal cost to their family members back home, they're sort of less inclined to pick up the cudgels. But getting to the changes, maybe we can talk about that on economics, but my biggest hope first is for critical thinking. Clearly, the policies we've been following since basically the first President Marcos left and the crisis that engulfed the 80s, and for both administrations, the Marcos and the first President Marcos and the first President Aquino, what the policies we followed in the aftermath of both of that have led to growth, but at a discount and at a slower pace than our larger neighbors, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam. So we need to have a new direction. And my hope is everything in this country seems to be political. In other countries, like you look at Korea and Taiwan, they even have martial arts fights in the legislature. So you can't tell me they don't feel very passionate about their political differences. The difference for me, in my observation, is that many issues are considered consensus issues. Education, healthcare, food security, more jobs, industrial policy. Those are not controversial decisions which are changed administration to administration. They are basically a consensus that continues. And they have big fights over everything else, but those key parts of the economy and of the social system continue regardless. And I wish we could move to that direction. Like, do we think it's a political issue to have quality education, to stop malnutrition, to provide decent infrastructure? I would think, and then have an industrial policy to create quality manufacturing jobs. And that's a complex issue. That's not easy. That is something that should go beyond any administration. It should be a consensus. Let me give you the simplest, most successful example, which is taught in many schools in the US, the Interstate public highway system. In the 1930s, when he was still a colonel, then Colonel Eisenhower was told transport a whole armored troop from the East Coast to the West Coast, just in case we have to move troops and material elsewhere. It took him a few weeks. He was aghast at how actually bad quality infrastructure was in the US then. When he won as president in 1952, he decided to start the interstate highway system. So what happened was what was called the flyover states, which were the prairie states and the South, all had quality infrastructure. It has now been 70 years since that started. There have been Republican administrations, Democrat administrations, liberals, conservatives, moderates. That continues regardless. It is a non-controversial policy that has benefited the US greatly. And many other countries, Japan, Korea, Germany, France, followed it. Shouldn't things like that be a consensus for us that doesn't change regardless of which administration is in charge?
We fully agree with you. We also don't know the answer. But that brings me to my next question about term limits. You wrote a column recently on the Manila Times where you argued that term limits have failed in practice. It hasn't led to a higher quality of elected officials. Talk us through that.
Well, my view is I see the point and the principle behind the framers of the 1987 Constitution putting term limits. What was it? To prevent dynasties and to keep, let's just say, unqualified people who have a strong political base from perpetuating itself. Did it work? It didn't. So let's just accept reality. And I would rather if some good legislators win or elected officials, governors, mayors, whatever, I'd rather have a chance to keep them rather than to term limit them out, given how small the odds are already of excellent people continuing to win. So let's help the few who can win. Now, I understand the view on the presidency, which is because of previous history, we're worried about, given how powerful our presidents become in practice, regardless of what was written in the Constitution in 1987, which substantially weakened the powers of the president vis-a-vis the 1973 Constitution and even the 1935. So I can see their point about term limits for the president. But even then, you look at what Latin America did. They moved Peru, Chile, and Argentina and Brazil went from 1 6-year term to 2 4-year terms. And after that, you have to stop. But after another term, you can come back. That's why Lula in Brazil is on his 3rd term. So you can put a limit so that you can basically say the guy cannot keep perpetuating himself. But after a gap, if he's really that much better than his successor and he's still in good health and he's interested, why not let him run again, him or her?
So are you for longer terms, or are you for banning them from running again after several consecutive terms? What is your proposal?
I have an open mind. My proposal, like all proposals, like when we discuss economic provisions, is can we think about it? Can we study it? Can we analyze what other countries have done? Can we analyze our situation and then have a robust discussion? And then let us have a right, if not a right decision, a proper decision that's ventilated rather than somebody wakes up in the morning and decides, I want to do this, and then we do it or we don't. Again, critical thinking and analysis. And you know what? If we make a change and it's wrong, then change it again. One of the key points of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal was experimentation, because there was a depression and a crisis. And they said, if it doesn't work, we'll change to something else. But let's not just have a fossilized, tight structure that is incapable of adoption.
Circling back to the debate over term limits, again, your thesis being that they haven't worked as they should. But then also the idea, if you take away that guardrail, then it also opens up the gates to abuse of power, doesn't it?
Well, let's start with the presidency and the other positions. in the other positions, because the president has an absolute 1 6-year term, and I can see why you don't want at least consecutive terms for the same president. I completely understand that position. But let's look at below that. Senators, governors, mayors, congressmen. Has term limits worked? They've just, in the old days, I was 13 years old when martial law was declared in 1973, but you had basically one person who would basically be mayor and governor for until he retired or something. And then if he was really lousy, he could lose. But has it really stopped dynasties? No, you've just expanded it to their family. When before you had one person, now you have one family. And all the members become politicians. So it hasn't worked.
Yeah. And then eventually
Now,
there
at
are
the
too
same
many
time-
and they
Go ahead,
start
please.
fighting, right? But it also is, I think, I wanted to put it in this conversation while you're answering Regina's question, because we seem to be allergic also to changing our constitution. And I think that kind of plays a part in this whole thing. How do we, if we're talking about so much change and we can't even change the constitution, which apparently was meant for a parliamentary system, not a presidential one, then where does that leave us?
I agree with you. It's very hard to change, and it was frankly not very carefully thought out when everything was written towards parliamentary in the last minute. They changed to presidential and 2 houses, okay? So what are we supposed to do? Not change it because it's hard? Or try harder to change it and maybe, let's have a consensus on at least some changes first, and then maybe it will allow, if they work out well, further changes. We don't have to have all the changes in one go. And maybe the Supreme Court maybe is overdue to decide how the Senate and the House are supposed to vote. Let's settle that. The Supreme Court hasn't settled it. And then whatever the Supreme Court decides, then let's try to get changes that are appropriate for that. But it reminds me of what Kennedy said when he was talking about putting a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, which was achieved in 1969. He said, we do this not because it was easy, but because it is hard. Hard things are normally the important things that need to get done. Well, I would say there was another thing I saw on Amazon or something where it was a funny comment, which I think maybe we follow. We do this not because it was easy, but because we thought it was easy.